of Carmen's self. When other people dictate the terms of your authenticity, that's the definition of inauthentic. Just ask Alicia Menendez. It's happened to her multiple times.
I was told that I needed to liven up my look and get some t-shirts and some leather jackets and wear the things that the kids were wearing. And I was somehow supposed to become that edgy, hip, cool person instead of just being my, 30-something dorky self.
Alicia is now an anchor at MSNBC and the author of The Likeability Trap, a book about the pressure women face to be who other people want them to be.
I sometimes get the sense, and other women I spoke with got the sense, that when they were told, be yourself, it wasn't be whoever that is. It was be who I expect that person to be, predicated on your gender, your race, your ethnicity, how old you are, and then show up as my imagined version of who that ought to be. There is often a sense that I would benefit professionally if I were less Latina-ish Liz Lemon and more, to quote Cardi B, spicy mommy hot tamale. It would be like, I need this, but smoky. A Latina is supposed to self-present, and that can be a wild caricature. Now, I got to say, Adam, I've also heard it from Latinas on the complete flip, where their English is accented and they're told that they need to tone down their Latina-ness. So it takes lots of forms.
If someone is pushing you to fit their idea of your authentic self, especially if it's based on stereotypes, something has gone very wrong.
I'm just curious, have you ever gotten any of this? Have you ever been sort of given the sense that you could be something other than the way you are?
No. Every once in a while I get suggestions like you should move less like a Muppet. But that's more objective. Let's try to get you to move and communicate more like a normal person.
No one's ever told you how to be more professor-ish.
No.
I think what sometimes gets lost in this conversation when you talk to people who work at companies that are telling them to bring their whole selves to work, they often feel that the company hasn't done the work necessary to receive them as they are. And it even seemed to me that sort of the louder and the more insistent an organization was about bringing your whole self to work, almost the less work they'd done to make that actually possible.
People who don't fit the dominant culture in an organization learn the hard way that they sometimes have to hide their authentic identities and ideas. They try to fit into that expectation, intentionally or subconsciously, even though it doesn't feel right. Let's say the conformity pressure you're feeling at work is about norms and values, not cultural stereotypes. How do you break through that pressure and get heard when people don't want to listen?
When you're a minority, however you might be a minority in an organization, you're already a rebel.
To get her career back on track at the CIA, Carmen Medina didn't have to suppress her identity as an original thinker, but she did need to build up her reputation as someone committed to the mission. And so this is guideline number 3. Authenticity without status and trust is risky. Before you challenge organizational culture,
Okay, so any thoughts or reactions to that? Because I think that is one of the pieces around authenticity that I really appreciate, is that trying to push back or be too much yourself is often grounded, or it happens after trust and credibility is built. And that's one of the things that's hard in an interview, right? Because you haven't built that trust or credibility, which is why I think we often are trying to figure out what the push-pull is around how we present in an interview. Does that make sense? Yeah, authenticity without status and trust is risky. Yeah, absolutely. So what I would like to kind of move forward in thinking about, instead of authentic professionalism, we think about empowered professionalism. And I think that's where we come to think about what parts of myself are core, what parts are continuous and will evolve, and what am I going to grow, learn, and discover through me presenting myself, right? So what parts are core, what parts are continuous, and what am I going to grow, learn, and discover? And empowered professionalism is, in many ways, what I think is most important about it is that you understand what's core. You come to understand some of these norms and expectations so that you know what party you're going to, and then you get to decide if that's the party you want to be at, right? And so where I want to start today is really in that question that that was posed around. A lot of these organizations say, come as you are, we want your authentic self here, but they're not really ready to receive us in the way that we are. And so normally when we start to think about interviewing, we immediately go to how am I going to present myself? And where I want to start the conversation today is, what questions are you going to ask the organization to see how much it fits with who you are at your core and what's important to you? So today we're going to start with, what questions are you going to ask and what your values are? And so I know that Sujin sent a message out yesterday, and you've all been doing some work around values this week, right? To help kind of articulate what is your value, what is core to who you are. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly. We've asked you to kind of go into Imagine PhD and take the values assessment, and that really, oh, sorry, I meant to hit present. And that is really just to help you kind of articulate these 5 things. But where I want to start today is, you are interviewing them. So this is not just a one-way. You're not at like, you know, the whim of the interviewer. You get to decide too. And in deciding where you want to work, values should be at the basis of that kind of decision making, right? And those values can be, I want to make some money. I want to give everybody permission to make money. That's okay. But it also might be like self-expression is really important to me, and creativity, and being and showing up in whatever I want to wear, or wearing my space buns, right? Those things can all be really core. And so what we're going to do is move you all into kind of breakout rooms in a moment, because the way that you articulate your values is very different to everyone. So if you log into Imagine PhD or pull up the values worksheet that you worked on earlier this week, and figure out, you know, what are my top 5 values? And then what does that mean to me? So oftentimes I hear from graduate students, balance is really important to me, but that looks very different to different people. And so really kind of laying that out is, it's really important for me to not take work home and to work like an 8 to 5. Or it means I need to be able to go in and out of work throughout the day, which means I don't work an 8 to 5, but I get the work done on my own time, flexibly, right? So what we're going to do is move into breakout rooms, small breakout rooms, and really have you articulate with a partner what your values are and what they mean, and then what are the questions you need to ask. And I think the biggest part here is, how do you ask those questions, right? Because it's pretty hard in a first interview to say, how much money am I going to make here? Right? And so how do we ask or vet the places that we're in? And the reason I say go to Imagine PhD is because it gives you some vetting strategies, but I think you can all come up with much better ones based on your own particular situations. So you're going to work with a partner to come up with 3 to 5 questions that you would want to ask in the interview. And I can't tell you how important those questions can be. As somebody who has hired a lot of PhD students over the course of my time in this profession, the questions that are asked often make or break how I feel about that candidate, because it helps me understand what's important to them and what will work together in terms of our future work. Okay, so everybody, when we're going into breakout rooms, I really appreciate you going camera on. If you're not going to go into a breakout room, then just don't add, and we'll move people around based on that to make sure that everybody has a partner. Sujin, can you open breakout rooms, or do you want me to do that?
Sure, I can do that. Let me see. So I think I will.
Do you want me to assign automatically?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and do that?
Okay. Provisional, your provisional self, right? And so I think one of the challenges around authenticity is that sometimes it can leave us in a, like, this is what it means for me to be authentic, which might not shift or move. And we're authentic in a variety of ways, in a variety of roles. And in order to kind of move into some of these new work environments, we have to test what I call that provisional self, right? And start to kind of learn and develop. And so now we're kind of shifting into, we understand what's core to who we are, now learning what's continuous and what are the things we might need to learn and develop in the interview. And so I'm going to play one more quick clip from my podcast that I think is particularly relevant to newer professionals. It's only about 2 minutes. And then we're going to move into
Herminia wanted to explore how we adapt to new roles at work. So she launched a study of how young professionals navigate career transitions. She didn't start out focusing on authenticity, but she quickly saw that for the participants, finding their authentic selves was a big challenge.
That was a study of how young consultants and investment bankers managed the transition away from doing analytical and project work to actually having to be rainmakers and to manage relationships with clients. And so they had to kind of put on an image of something that they felt they were not quite yet.
The bankers and consultants were testing out what she called provisional selves, and it made some of them uncomfortable.
It was a real sense that this isn't me. I can't myself that way. I'm going to have to find my own way through this. It was just really a major threat to their sense of self.
So they stuck to their existing identities, instead of trying new styles of self-presentation that felt unfamiliar to them. As a result, they often struggled to adapt to and excel in their new roles. But others embraced it. They'd observe their senior colleagues being assertive with some clients while gently guiding others. And they'd experiment with those provisional selves to make them their own. The most successful young professionals in her study weren't worried about staying true to themselves. They were striving to develop themselves.
The knee-jerk reaction is, I'm fixed, this is who I am, and this is not, this is just not within the realm of the possible. And the minute you say to people, does being authentic condemn you to being as you always have been, they get it. Identity, it's super multifaceted. It's made up of, traits, roles, emotions, aspirations, all of these kinds of things.
That's a key lesson here. No one has just one authentic self. We have multiple selves. Think about all the identities you hold at work. Your taskmaster self is probably different from your mentor self, your presenter self, and your conference call self. And I hope it's different from your drinks after work self. You get to choose.
Okay. So as we're kind of testing out our provisional selves, I'm going to throw you all into the fire again. And I probably should have mentioned this at the beginning. This is going to be pretty interactive because we're talking about interviewing, which is a skill you develop. We're going to practice that skill. And so I want you to take a look at these jobs or think about your dream job and identify kind of the title and organization. And you can completely make this up. I've given you some to kind of pick from. So a grants program manager, a UCHRI, a content strategist at the Sundance Film Festival, curriculum designer at Duolingo, publications manager at LA Review of Books, or maybe an academic partnerships manager at Facebook, or maybe a data scientist at, I don't know, Wikimedia, I don't know, but write down the title and the organization that you want to work at, right? And I'm going to have you practice answering the first question. And that is, tell me about yourself and why you're interested in this position. And so when we're in person, I usually have everyone record themselves, but I'm not going to make you all do that. So today I'm going to put you in pairs and you're going to make sure you remember the name of the person that you're with. So write down their name. And they should tell you the title and organization that they want to work at. And then you'll ask them this interview question. Tell me about yourself and why you're interested in this position. This is going to be a short breakout room, probably only about 4 minutes. And let me see if I can get to breakouts. You'll be automatically assigned, and I'm going to recreate the rooms really quickly. 4, 5, create 6. So you should be with a new partner. All right, everybody, you'll run into your rooms and then you'll come back really quickly. Make sure you both have time to answer the question. Yes, then maybe, yes, we can do thumbs up, thumbs down. You're like, no, I was not listening 2 minutes long. Okay, did you talk specifically about the job and the organization? Yes, no, kinda, a little bit. Okay, did you disclose only what you'd planned to disclose? Right? Or did you all of a sudden end up starting to like talk about like, well, I started high school in 1995. Did we go there? Yeah, okay. Did you maintain eye contact? Which is tough on Zoom, right? But easier when it's one-on-one. Did you communicate confidence? Do you know if you did? You're like, I have no idea. It's hard. And then do you have a friendly demeanor? So this I want to talk to specifically when we're talking about women, because there is a lot around the smile, right? And being taken seriously. And I think the biggest thing is just being open. So oftentimes this question is tough because we don't know what they're really asking. And what they're actually asking is not so much for you to tell them about yourself, because they likely already have your resume and your cover letter. What they really want to know is, why are you the right candidate for this specific job at this specific organization? And so I think the biggest mistake that people make in the interview is they really think it's this opportunity to talk a lot about themselves. And what we want to be doing is talking about the organization and how we fit into that organization. It's like dating. Terribly, I'm going to use the worst metaphor ever, but like getting a job is just like dating, in that you don't want, like if you said, well, I'm really interested in consulting, because that's like going on a date with somebody who says, I'm really interested in women, right? You want to know why they're particularly interested in you. And that's what organizations want to know, is like, why are you interested in working here now? What is it about us that you particularly like? And so what I'm going to ask is for your partner, and it should always be less than 2 minutes. It should always be less than 2 minutes, which I know is really hard, but trying to keep it short so that they're interested. You're always gauging, are they interested? Are they engaged? If they're not, cut it off and move on. Right? Because how you make people feel in the interview lasts a lot longer than what they actually remember you did. They'll remember how they felt. So we're gonna, here are some of the goals for the second half of the workshop today. We're gonna talk about first impressions. I'm gonna give you a storytelling framework for interviews, so that you feel more prepared for that first question. And then we're really going to translate and answer some of the tough and illegal questions that often kind of stump us or get us, that surprise us unexpectedly. When somebody asks you if you plan to have kids or if you're married or something they shouldn't, right? So we'll talk through some of those. I want to give everybody a break. Before you go on break, I would like you to chat to the person you were just talking to what the 3 things are that you remember from what they told you about themselves, right? So top 3 things. Hopefully you remember who you were in a breakout room with. If not, send me a message and I'll let you know who it is. But before we go on break for about 10 minutes, go ahead and send a chat to your partner and let them know what are the 3 things you remembered from meeting with them. And then we'll come back and talk about first impressions. Let me stop my share. Does that sound good? Thank you. Yes. Okay, we'll see you all in about 10 minutes. Please text or send that message to your partner. And we'll take a little break. I'm going to take a little break. Okay, Sujin. When you're back. Great. So this is where we get kind of heavier into the content. So first, you should have received the 3 things that the other person remembered about you. And that's always a great way to kind of check and see if the way you're presenting yourself is actually what people are picking up. And if there's anything there that you're like, oh, that wasn't my goal, right? And so really a lot of this starts in that first impression. And so I'm going to share my screen and just talk a little bit about first impression and how you might want to show up. So again, I'm going to talk about some of the expectations. It doesn't mean that I agree with them or think that they are fair, right? These are just some of the kind of professionalized expectations in an interview. And so these are the aspects that I think are really important. And I'm going to pose the question again, what's core? When we're thinking about the first impression, what's core to who you are, what's continuous, and what can you learn and develop, right? And so in that first impression, they often say that someone's mind is made up within the first 6 seconds, which sucks because a lot of unconscious bias kind of comes into play then. But what I always say is it's really important that they remember you, that they remember you, not necessarily your perfume or, you know, your earrings, but they remember you. And so that really is kind of the goal around the first impression. So thinking about your appearance, what's core, what's continuous, and what can you learn and develop. Understanding. So when I think about appearance, I always say, like, try to dress like one step above what the expectations are in that environment, right? If you show up in a full-on suit at Riot Games wants you to show up in like a hoodie and like sweatpants. And so really making sure you're kind of matching the context for the place that you're interviewing for. If you're interviewing at an ad agency, I would expect to have kind of more trendy stuff going on, right? Than if you're interviewing at a more conservative organization. Just trying to mirror them. Also with nonverbal communication, mirroring them. If you notice they're disengaging or moving away, then those are moments to kind of stop and pull back and kind of reassess and ask them a question. Punctuality, I always recommend being a few minutes early. With Zoom, especially, you'll want to kind of practice everything and record yourself in front of whatever your background is, just so you can see what it looks like to them. So that's a really great option we have now. And then courtesy. So something I've heard multiple times from employers is we're really paying attention to everyone you interact with and their impressions, because these are all people who are part of our team. And so also paying attention to, if you go to lunch, how are you treating the wait staff, right? With respect and dignity. How are you managing those in between times when things don't go right? I remember interviewing a person at Duke whose PowerPoint wouldn't pull up, and she kind of had like a meltdown, obviously because it's anxiety producing. But I think in that moment, we were like, ooh, like this is going to be tough because lots of things don't work at the university in those short moments, right? And so how you handle those things can be really important. And nervousness. So I think there's a lot of power in acknowledging that you're a little bit nervous, especially if you can feel your lip trembling or you can feel the nerves coming through. Not focusing on it, but saying, you know, could you repeat yourself? I'm sorry, I'm a little bit nervous right now, is a really humbling, good thing to do that I think everybody understands when people are nervous in an interview. Now, you don't want to repeat that throughout, because then what they'll remember is how nervous you were. But I think acknowledging it at the beginning is a really strong thing to do. And then the other two little pieces, small talk. So I hate small talk with a vengeance. I just can't stand it, but it's so important to be prepared with short, open-ended questions that you can ask people as you're being walked down the hall or as you're getting in the car to go to lunch. Those little conversation starters that aren't like about the weather, that are actually about their job, them, or the organization. What have you loved the most about working here? What have you seen as being some of the biggest challenges, right? How long have you worked here, and why, if you've been there for a long time, what keeps you here, right? Having those little questions that aren't necessarily small talk, but that get people to open up about themselves, can really engage and get people kind of to feel really good. So people really enjoy conversations where they've done the majority of the talking. That's just a fact. Okay, and then last, put your phone away. The other thing I was going to mention about that first impression, I have been in some Zoom interviews where we could tell they were reading, and they had written a bunch of notes and were reading those, and that immediately breaks the connection between you and the interviewer. And so making sure that you're not reading or memorizing, that you're more focused on the interaction between the two of you than the content you have to say, goes a really long ways. So dressing for the interview is this, I'm gonna suggest pants. even if it's a Zoom interview, I'm gonna suggest pants to everyone. But I think beyond that, really, because we're in this Zoom age, I think the other thing that's become so interesting is we are in people's homes. And the expectations of like professional are very different across industries. And so do kind of your research and wear pants. Okay, here are some of the things not to do. So never say anything negative about your former coworkers or boss. That'll immediately lead to kind of some mistrust in the interview, even if you had a terrible boss. Those are things you can disclose later once you have the job. Really try to stay away from rambling. And so this framework that we're about to go over will keeps you kind of in the lines and keeps you kind of focused on what you're planning to say. Rambling often also leads to kind of vague or unclear ways to talk about yourself. And I think it can also lead you to asking questions you may not have intended to ask, or disclosing things you didn't intend to disclose. And so try to stay away from money or time off. I was in an interview, I interviewed a graduate student last week and asked her, why do you want to work here? And she said, because it's because it's exactly 10 hours a week and it pays really well. And I was like, anything else? Right. And so those might be some of the things, but don't bring those into the interview, into that first impression or the interview. Don't ask them personal questions. They're not supposed to ask you personal questions. And when you open up that door, it swings both ways. And there might be a question that comes up that you feel obligated to answer because you had asked a personal question. And then go to an interview. So this is really big. Make decisions about what you plan to share about yourself before you walk in, and what's important to you or what's at your core versus what you don't want to share. And that all comes down to being prepared. Okay, so we're gonna go into kind of a little self-reflection. I know those of you who were in Derek's session yesterday had an opportunity to really think about your strengths and what kinds of things you can do in some of these new venues. And I think if you have that in front of you, that's a great place to start. For those who were not in Derek's session, just pull any piece of paper out and we're going to do a 3-minute free write that really is just a brain dump. And we're going to do a SWOT analysis. So for those that aren't familiar with a SWOT analysis, you're articulating your strengths in relation to the job, right? Do you have the skills? Are there things about that particular job that relate to any of your research or teaching interests or hobbies that you've done, right? What are your weaknesses or areas for improvement? And so I always recommend kind of doing this assessment before going into an interview, so you're prepared to kind of answer and account for some of these things. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes to really do a strengths and weaknesses analysis, but I want to introduce you to the other 2 aspects that can really help you prepare. Opportunities would be, external things or trends that you might know about that could inform the interview, or ways you bring additional value. So let's say you're looking at a nonprofit and you notice that the website is crap and you might have a little bit of website design skills. Although you're applying to be the content strategist, making sure that they also know that you have some website design and ways that you can kind of contribute in that area can be a huge benefit, right? And then threats. I always like to think about who is my competition? Is it an internal candidate? And how do I frame myself in a way that might overcome some of the benefits that who my steepest competition is? How do I frame myself to kind of overcome that? Because this is a competition when we're talking about interviewing for jobs, right? and being yourself. So I'm going to start my timer. You'll have 3 minutes to kind of just do this brain dump around either the job you picked for the interview question you just answered, or if you have a different job, but this all needs to be in context of a particular job, on your strengths and weaknesses. And I'll start that now. And as you're thinking about these, as you're brain dumping, you might be starting to run out of things. Try to be really specific. Think about not just a strength of having strong interpersonal communication, but the time when you used interpersonal communication effectively. And you can move into opportunities and threats. Okay, we have about 30 seconds left. Okay, we're gonna move on. I didn't know it did that sound. Okay, if you want to go ahead and drop some of those strengths in the chat, I'd love to see what you all came up with. And out of those strengths, I want you to identify 3, right? Qualities, skills, or experiences that you want them to remember. And so as you look at kind of this big laundry list of what are the things that I'm really good at, and it's really important to articulate those and start talking about those. But I want you to choose 3 quality skills or experiences that you want them to remember and put those in the chat. So my example is you might be a uniquely qualified researcher, a self-starter, right? You might have strong communication skills. Those are the 3 things I want someone to remember about me as I interview for this qualitative researcher position at a startup. What are the 3 things you want people to know about you? And that's going to act as our thesis, basically, for your stories. So what are the 3 things you want people to know in the interview about you? And if you could drop those in the chat, that would be great. Great. Time management, attention to detail, and strong communication skills. Excellent, Alejandra. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And so what can be really hard is not every interviewer is great at interviewing. So they might ask questions like, have you ever worked on a team? And what they really want to know is what kind of a role do you play on that team, right? And what are your contributions? So we're going to think about context first, describing the situation, the action you specifically took, and it's important to be very specific here, the results, and then you'll relate that to the particular job. So again, we're always kind of pulling back to why this matters in this particular context. So here is an example of that framework. So one of my favorite questions, tell me about a time you failed to complete a project on time. And here's the context. During the final year of my PhD, I failed to complete my dissertation by the agreed upon date set between me and my advisor. My access to a specific archive was unexpectedly cut off, and I had to make some significant changes to my research. The action you took is to complete the project. I worked on my literature review and independently developed an interviewing protocol to supplement the research, which ultimately took the project in a new direction. I communicated the progress at regular intervals with my advisor, who extended my timeline. So this is great, Alejandra, because I think right now we're demonstrating time management and strong communication skills. The result, although my work was delayed, it ended up producing higher quality work, which ultimately was a really positive result. I also think I communicated well, especially with those impacted. So they felt like their time was respected and they could plan accordingly. And then relating it. And this is probably the most important aspect, is understanding why they're asking the question and reassuring them why you're right for the job, right? So based on your question, it sounds like deadlines are important here. And I think my proactive communication style could be an asset. I should also add, this was definitely the exception. I work really well in timeline-driven projects. So the question I would always have for you is, would you be able to answer the question that way if you hadn't taken time to prepare for those questions? Building stories around these 8 areas will help you be prepared for any interviewing situation, because we know that they're likely always going to ask about communication skills, decision-making, teamwork, professional priorities, initiative, problem solving. And then what I think is the most important and what we're going to practice today is self-awareness. Almost all interviewers are going to ask you a question about your weakness, a time you failed. And if we're not prepared to answer that in a way that doesn't mean, that doesn't sound like, oh my gosh, I'm just too organized or I'm too good at my time management, that is more authentic and showing some vulnerability around some of the things that you can work on, but how you work on them, that's really, really important. So as I mentioned, a lot of times you'll get an interviewer who doesn't know how to ask questions, and they might ask a question like, tell me about a time you worked on a team. Really understanding what they're asking is, how well do you work with others in a team environment, and what your role is, what are your contributions? This framework gives you the opportunity to make sure that you are delivering a very clear story or example of what that looks like for them. What's an area of improvement a previous boss has brought to your attention? This is how aware are you of the things you need to improve, and what have you done to improve them? How open are you to feedback, right? And so some last tips before we go into our breakouts again. Making sure you understand and answer what they are actually asking. And so if you're nervous, ask them to repeat the question or repeat the question back to them so that they can clarify. I've seen a number of interviewees kind of go off and answer a question that we weren't actually asking. Lead with your results. So it's much more exciting. And this is a great strategy, particularly for phone interviews, because you can't see their reaction. But if you lead with, yeah, we were on a team and we created this novel proposal that was funded by the university for $5,000, and then starting to tell them what you actually did makes them interested immediately. So leading with results can be really, really helpful. Gauge your interest and adjust as you go. So if you feel like people aren't engaged, then switch directions, move in a different way, or stop talking and ask them a question. The best interviews ultimately are interviews that turn into conversations. Focus more on connecting than telling, and try to remove the student from your examples. So this is particularly important as you're trying to kind of move into this next space of talking about yourself as a researcher or teacher and not as a graduate student. And then ask good questions, which I think we've already kind of addressed. Lastly, these are all questions that are off the table. They're illegal, like country of origin, sexual orientation, marital or family status. That doesn't mean that they're not going to ask. And so having a plan for how you're going to answer these questions can be really helpful. And so what I am going to do is put all of these in the chat. I'm going to send you into breakout rooms and ask you to answer 2 of these questions. So you can pick, tell me about a project you led, tell me about a time you failed, right? And then work with your partner on figuring out how to answer some of these questions that are illegal and how you might answer that. And then we'll come back for Q&A. So I'm opening up the breakout rooms now. I'm going to ask you to go camera on for your breakout room. Oh, let me see if I can find this. Sujin, I can't find the breakout room thing. Oh, here we go. All right, I'm going to open the rooms and send you in, and I will put this in the chat.